Your thumb hovers over the screen. You have read the message 4 times. You know exactly what it says. You open it again anyway, as if the 5th reading might rearrange the words into something you can survive. This is not really about the message. It never is. You have done this before, with other screens, other rooms, other silences you filled with the same rehearsed sentence. It's not the right time. You said it about the job, the conversation you didn't have, the version of your life you keep postponing until the conditions are perfect. The conditions are never perfect. You already know that. You knew it the last time too. What you are about to hear will not tell you to think positive. You have tried that. It didn't work, and it wasn't supposed to, because nobody ever showed you how the machine actually runs. There is a mechanism underneath your life, operating whether you notice it or not. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is the part nobody tells you at the start. You didn't lose the thing you're grieving right now. You built the room where losing it was the only outcome available to you, one unnoticed thought at a time, long before it happened. That sentence will not make sense yet. It isn't supposed to. Hold on to it. You'll need it later. Based on the book The Master Key System by Charles F. Haanel, and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The Room You Already Know. The first sign is never dramatic. It's the moment you notice the walls were always there. You felt it before you had language for it. Standing in a kitchen at 11 at night, dishes done, house quiet, and a low current running under your ribs that has nothing to do with the dishes. You call it stress. You call it a bad week. You call it tired. It has 100 names and none of them are accurate. Because what you're actually feeling in that kitchen is the friction between the life your mind keeps building and the life you keep insisting you want. Nobody points this out to you directly, so you learn to live alongside it. You get good at living alongside it. You develop routines that manage the current without ever asking where it comes from. Coffee at 6. Scroll for 20 minutes. Handle the inbox before it handles you. None of these are wrong. None of these are the problem. They're simply the scaffolding you built around a room you never fully walked into. Here is the room. Every result in your life right now. The relationship that feels thin. The account balance that never quite settles. The body you argue with in the mirror. The promotion that went to someone else. All of it arrived through the same door. Not through luck. Not through other people's decisions. Though it's tempting to believe that, because blame is lighter than authorship. It arrived through a pattern of thought so consistent, so repeated, so unremarkable in its daily appearance, that you stopped registering it as a decision at all. You started calling it who you are. This is the first thing you have to sit with, and it will not feel good. You are not the victim of your circumstances. You are, in a way you have never been taught to recognize, their author. Every single day, in ways too small to catch in the moment, you are making a choice about where your attention goes, and that attention is not neutral. It is the most expensive currency you own, and you have been spending it on autopilot for years. Think about the last argument you replayed in your head for 3 days after it ended. The other person moved on in an hour. You kept living inside it, turning it over, rehearsing what you should have said, feeling the same flush of heat in your chest each time you returned to it. That replaying wasn't an accident of a strong memory. It was your mind doing exactly what you trained it to do, because somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to, you taught it that this is where attention belongs, not on what you want, on what wounds you. This is not a character flaw, it's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be studied. The version of you that exists right now, the one reading this in whatever room you're in, carrying whatever weight you're carrying, is the sum of every thought you've allowed to repeat without question. Not the thoughts you had once and let go, the ones you kept, the ones you fed day after day, until they stopped being thoughts and became furniture. You stopped seeing the chair because you walk past it every day. You stopped seeing the belief because you think it every day. You didn't choose most of that furniture consciously. Somebody handed you the first pieces before you were old enough to object. A parent's anxiety about money became your quiet certainty that there's never quite enough. A teacher's offhand comment about your handwriting became a lifelong story about not being a careful person. None of these arrived with your permission, but you kept them. You dusted them. You rearranged your entire house around them without once asking whether they belonged there. Here is where it gets uncomfortable, and here is where most people close the book, turn off the recording, go make dinner instead. Because if the room was built by your own attention, repeated and unexamined, then the responsibility for what happens next also belongs to you. Not the blame, the responsibility. Those are different words for a reason. Blame looks backward and searches for who to punish. Responsibility looks at the current moment and asks what you're going to do with it, starting now, starting today, starting with the very next thought you choose to keep or release. You don't have to fix your whole life this week. Nobody's asking you to overhaul 20 years of furniture in an afternoon. What's being asked of you is smaller and, in its own way, far more demanding. Notice. Notice the thought before it becomes the mood. Notice the mood before it becomes the decision. Notice the decision before it becomes the result you'll spend the next 6 months trying to understand. There was a version of you, once, before the furniture arrived, that walked into every room without expecting to be disappointed by it. That version is not gone. It's underneath the arrangement you've built on top of it, patient, unbothered by time, waiting for you to start moving the pieces. There's a distinction worth drawing here before we go further. The difference between a habit and a home. A habit is something you do. A home is something you stop noticing you're inside of, because it has become the assumed backdrop against which everything else gets measured. This is why telling someone to just change their thinking rarely works. You cannot simply decide to stop living in your own house. You have to first walk through it, room by room, with the lights on, before you can even see what you'd be leaving behind. Most people never get that far. They hear that their thoughts shape their results, nod along, and go straight back to rearranging the furniture inside the same 4 walls, because nobody showed them how to find the door. Consider how differently you'd treat a stranger's house compared to your own. Walk into someone else's home for the first time, and you notice everything. The chair angled oddly toward the window, the photograph turned face down on the shelf, the silence in a room that clearly used to hold more furniture than it does now. You'd ask questions. You'd be curious rather than defensive, because none of it is yours to protect. Now turn that same attention on your own house, the one you've lived in so long you've stopped seeing the walls. The same curiosity is available to you here. It simply requires a decision you haven't made yet. The decision to walk through your own rooms the way a stranger would, noticing instead of assuming, asking instead of explaining. That decision, small as it sounds, is the actual beginning of everything this book is going to walk you through. You don't need a full inventory today. One room is enough to start with, the one that's been the loudest, the one you've walked past most often while telling yourself it wasn't worth the trip inside. You'll want proof before you believe any of this. Fair. You should want proof. Nobody sensible rearranges their whole understanding of themselves on a hunch. So here's where we start looking for it. Together. One room at a time. Starting with the one you've been avoiding the longest. The reason you keep walking past the same furniture and calling it the view. Chapter 2. The Denial That Works. You know exactly what's wrong. You've known for months, maybe years. It surfaces at 2 a.m. with total clarity, then vanishes by the time your alarm goes off, replaced by the version of the day that lets you get dressed and leave the house without dealing with it. That's not forgetting. Forgetting is passive. What you're doing is active, and it's remarkably well engineered. Because the mind does not deny things randomly. It denies the things that would cost too much to admit while you're still living inside the structure built around them. You're not blind to the truth. You're protecting a system that depends on not seeing it yet. Here's the part that stings. This denial isn't a weakness. It's a skill. You are good at it. You've had years of practice, refining the exact angle at which you glance toward the problem without letting your eyes land on it directly. The way you can look at the sun's reflection in a window without ever looking at the sun. You built this ability the same way you build any skill, through repetition. And repetition always gets faster, quieter, more automatic. The first time you avoided the truth about the relationship, or the job, or the way you talk to yourself when no one's listening, it probably felt like a decision. By the 100th time, it didn't feel like anything at all. It just felt like Tuesday. Consider the friend who tells you every few months that this next version of the same relationship will be different. She isn't lying to you. She's not even lying to herself in the way people mean when they say that. She has built an entire internal case, brick by brick, for why this time carries different evidence than the last 4 times. The case is elaborate. The case is sincere. The case exists because building it is less expensive, moment to moment, than the alternative, admitting that the pattern is the point, not the exception to it. You've built a case like that too. Everyone has at least one. It might be about money, the story that you're bad with it because of how you were raised, a story that conveniently excuses you from examining the specific, repeatable choices you make every Friday night. It might be about your health, the story that you'll start once things calm down, when things have never once calmed down, and you know that, somewhere beneath the story, you know that. Here is a distinction that will do more work for you than almost anything else in this book. There is a difference between not knowing and not yet being ready to know. Not knowing is innocent. It asks for information. Not yet being ready to know already possesses the information and has simply filed it somewhere it won't be found by accident. You are not an uninformed person walking around blind. You are an informed person who has built with real skill a filing system designed to keep certain files closed. Why would you do that to yourself? Not out of weakness, out of protection. The mind treats your current identity, your current story about who you are and what you're capable of, as something to be defended at almost any cost, because identity is the operating system everything else runs on. If admitting the truth about the pattern threatens the operating system itself, not just one file but the whole architecture, the mind will resist that admission with a force that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with survival. It is not trying to keep you stupid. It is trying to keep you standing. This is why willpower alone has never been enough for you. Not really, not for longer than a few weeks at a time. You've tried to force your way past denial with sheer resolve, and it's worked briefly, the way holding your breath works, briefly. But willpower is a conscious, effortful faculty, and denial doesn't live in the conscious layer. It lives underneath it, in the automatic machinery that runs your defaults while your conscious attention is busy elsewhere, checking email, driving home, half listening to a conversation. You cannot out-effort a mechanism that operates below the level where effort happens. So what actually breaks it? Not confrontation. Confrontation makes the mind defend harder, the same way a hand closes tighter around something you try to yank away. What breaks functional denial is something quieter and, at first, almost disappointing in how undramatic it feels. Sustained, honest attention, applied without judgment, to the exact moment the avoidance happens, not the pattern in general. The specific instant. Tonight or tomorrow, there will be a moment where you feel the pull to look away from something you already know. A text you won't open, a number you won't check, a sentence forming in your head that you'll swallow instead of saying. That instant is not a failure. That instant is data. And data is the only thing that can actually move you, because you cannot change what you refuse to locate. Try this, not as a discipline, but as an experiment you're curious about. The next time you feel that specific pull, the small flinch away from a truth, pause for 4 seconds before you look away. Don't force yourself to look. Just notice the flinch itself, the way you'd notice a reflex in someone else's hand. 4 seconds. That's the entire ask. You are not trying to fix the pattern in that moment. You are trying to see it clearly enough, once, that it stops being invisible. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because the thing about denial is that it only works in the dark. It requires you to not be looking directly at it while it operates. The instant you watch it happen, really watch it, without flinching away from the flinching itself, it loses a piece of the power that made it automatic. Not all of it, not yet, but a piece. You are not broken for having built this system. You built it the way anyone builds a shelter, out of necessity, in conditions that made it the smartest option available to you at the time. The shelter isn't the enemy. Living in it long after the storm has passed is. There's a version of this you've probably lived through with someone else, which makes it easier to see than in yourself. Think of a colleague who insists every single review cycle that this year the promotion will finally come, while quietly avoiding the one conversation that would actually change the outcome. You can see the avoidance from the outside instantly. It's obvious. What's not obvious, standing where you're standing, is that someone else could watch your life with that same clarity and see your version of the same trick in about 4 seconds. Denial only works from the inside. That's the whole design of it. There is a truth waiting in the room you've been circling for months, maybe years, glancing at its edges without ever turning to face it directly. You already know roughly what it says. You've known for a while. The only question left, the one this entire chapter has been quietly building toward, is whether you're finally ready to stop filing it away and start reading it in full daylight. Chapter 3. The Name for It. There's a particular relief that comes from finally having a word for something you've only ever felt. You've experienced it before, somewhere else in your life. The moment a doctor named a symptom you'd been living with silently, or the moment someone described your childhood house and you realized other people grew up in houses like that too. Naming doesn't fix anything by itself, but it does something almost as important. It turns a shapeless weight into a specific object you can finally examine. You've been carrying something shapeless for a long time. It shows up as the tightness before you check your phone in the morning. It shows up as the low static under a conversation with someone you love, where you're technically present but somewhere behind your own eyes you're already gone. It shows up as the strange fatigue that hits you not from doing too much, but from doing the same wrong thing repeatedly and calling it effort. Here is the name for it. You have been living inside a thought you never examined, treating it as a fact about the world instead of a decision you keep making. That's the whole mechanism. Not complicated, not mystical. A single unexamined thought repeated with enough consistency hardens into something that feels indistinguishable from reality itself. This is different from what you were probably expecting. You may have come into this chapter looking for a diagnosis about circumstances, bad luck, a difficult family, an unfair market, people who let you down. Those things happened. Nobody's disputing that they happened. But the pattern this book is naming lives one layer beneath the events themselves, in the specific, repeatable way you interpret them, and then act from that interpretation as though it were simply how things are. Think of two people who each lose a job in the same week, at the same company, in the same round of cuts. One spends the next month telling a story about being discarded, unworthy, behind everyone else who kept their seat. The other spends the same month telling a story about redirection, about a door that needed to close so a hand would finally be free to open another one. Neither story is objectively true. Both are constructions, assembled in real time out of the same raw material. But watch what happens 6 months later. The stories don't just describe two different experiences of the same event. They produce two entirely different sets of actions, and those actions produce two entirely different lives. You have a story like that running right now quietly, about something specific to you. Maybe it's about money, and the story is that you're someone who works hard and still never gets ahead. Maybe it's about love, and the story is that you're someone people eventually leave. Maybe it's about your own capability, and the story is that you're smart enough to see what needs to change, but never disciplined enough to be the one who changes it. Here's the distinction that separates people who transform their lives from people who spend decades circling the same 6 disappointments. A belief and an observation feel identical from the inside. Both arrive with the same texture of certainty. Both feel like they're simply describing what's there. But an observation updates when new information appears. A belief recruits new information to confirm itself, and quietly discards anything that doesn't fit. If you've ever noticed every piece of evidence for a fear while somehow missing every piece of evidence against it, you weren't observing. You were confirming. This is why the pattern feels so durable, so resistant to good advice, so unmoved by the fact that you already know intellectually that it isn't serving you. Knowing a belief is inaccurate doesn't disarm it, because the belief was never operating on the level where accuracy matters. It was operating on the level where safety matters, where familiarity matters, where the predictable pain of staying the same has always felt more survivable than the unpredictable pain of becoming someone new. Sit with that for a second, because it's the real engine underneath everything you've been calling self-sabotage. You are not failing to change because you lack information. You've read the books. You've had the conversations. You know roughly what a better version of this looks like. You are not changing because some older, quieter part of you has calculated correctly that the current pattern is at least survivable. And survivable has always outranked better in the priorities of a mind built primarily to keep you alive rather than to make you thrive. That's not a life sentence. It's an explanation, and explanations are the first tool you get to work with. Here's how the pattern usually announces itself, if you know what to listen for. It rarely arrives as a full sentence. It arrives as a flinch, a sudden drop in energy right before you were about to try something, a wave of exhaustion that appears exactly when the conversation was about to get honest. Your body knows the pattern intimately, even in the moments your conscious mind is still arguing that everything's fine. The body doesn't lie about this the way the mind sometimes does. It just doesn't use words. You will start noticing it this week now that it has a name. That's simply how naming works. Once you know the shape of a specific pattern, your attention starts catching it in places it used to slide right past. Don't be alarmed when it shows up more often than you expected. It isn't getting worse. You're just finally able to see it. There is no fixing to do yet. That's not where this chapter is pointing you. This chapter is only asking you to do one thing, and it is smaller than it sounds and harder than it looks. The next time you catch the flinch, the drop in energy, the sentence that starts with, "That's just how I am," stop for exactly one breath and ask yourself a single question. Is this something I'm observing, or something I've decided so long ago and so many times that it stopped feeling like a decision at all? Here's a small test worth trying this week because it will show you the pattern faster than any amount of thinking about it in the abstract. Pick one recurring complaint you make about your life, out loud or in your head, and count how many times it repeats over 7 days. Not to judge the number, just to see it. Most people are stunned by how often the exact same sentence, almost word for word, gets rehearsed without ever once being questioned. That repetition is not proof the sentence is true. It's proof the sentence has a very well-worn road to travel on. And roads get used simply because they exist, not because they lead anywhere good. This is worth restating plainly, because it's the hinge the rest of this book swings on. The pattern is not the enemy. The unexamined repetition of the pattern is the enemy. Once it has a name, it stops being able to operate in the dark the way it has for years, and everything from here forward becomes a question of what you do with that light, not whether you can find it. You don't need the answer yet. You need the question, held clearly, the way you'd hold a lit match before deciding what to do with it. Everything in the chapters ahead depends on your willingness to keep asking it. Chapter 4. How the machine actually runs. You want to understand this without being told to trust it blindly, and that's the right instinct. So let's open it up. No metaphors about magnets or vibrations. Just the plain mechanics of how a thought becomes a life, laid out the way you'd trace wiring behind a wall. Start with attention. Attention is the only resource you spend every waking second, whether you're aware of spending it or not. Right now, it's on these words. 10 minutes ago, it was somewhere else, maybe on a worry that felt urgent and now feels distant. Attention moves constantly, and wherever it lands, it does something specific. It strengthens whatever it touches. Not metaphorically, functionally. The circuits in your mind that fire together, wire together, and the more often you route your attention toward a particular thought, a particular fear, a particular story about who you are, the stronger and faster that pathway becomes until it stops requiring conscious effort at all. It just fires, automatically, before you've decided anything. This is why the first time you told yourself you weren't good with money, it felt like an observation, and by the 1,000th time it felt like a fact of nature. Nothing about the underlying truth changed between the first time and the 1,000th. What changed was the pathway. You paved a road, then you paved it again, then you paved it so many times it became the only road your mind knew how to find in that part of the map. Here's the part that separates people who understand this mechanism from people who merely repeat slogans about it. The pathway doesn't care whether the thought is true. It only cares whether the thought is repeated. A false belief, rehearsed daily, becomes structurally stronger than a true one you consider once and set down. This is not a flaw in the system. It's simply what the system does, indifferent to content, responsive only to frequency. Feel that in your body for a second. Notice where a familiar worry sits when it arrives, the specific place in your chest or your jaw or your stomach where it always lands. That physical location isn't random either. Repeated thought doesn't stay confined to the mind. It recruits the body as an accomplice, tightening the same muscles, releasing the same low current of chemistry, until your body starts anticipating the thought before you've consciously had it. You've felt this, the dread that arrives in your stomach before you've even opened the email. Your body got there first because your body has run this circuit with you 1,000 times before, and it knows the route. Once a pathway is strong enough, it stops waiting for input. It starts generating its own. This is the part most people never grasp. And it's the part that makes the whole mechanism feel less like a bad habit and more like a haunting. A well-worn pathway doesn't sit passively, waiting for a matching event before it activates. It starts scanning for confirmation. It goes looking. You walk into a room, and some quiet and automatic process is already hunting for the detail that will justify the thought you've rehearsed 10,000 times. The slight in a friend's tone, the coolness in a partner's response, the number in an account that proves what you already decided was true about yourself long before you checked it. This is confirmation bias, but calling it that makes it sound abstract, academic, something that happens to other people in psychology studies. It is not abstract. It is happening in you today, in the specific texture of how you read a text message twice before responding, how you replay a comment from a meeting 3 hours after everyone else in the room has forgotten it was said. You are not paranoid. You are not oversensitive. You are running a very efficient search algorithm that you built yourself, one repetition at a time, and it is extremely good at its one job. So here is the mechanism in full, stated plainly. Attention repeats a thought. Repetition builds a pathway. The pathway recruits the body. The body recruits perception. Perception starts generating evidence. The evidence confirms the original thought, which strengthens the pathway further, which recruits the body more tightly, and the loop closes on itself, spinning faster with every pass, entirely on its own momentum. Nobody is doing this to you. You built the loop, and now the loop is doing what loops do. It's running. You might expect this chapter to end with outrage at yourself for building something so effective at working against you. Resist that. Outrage is just another loop, and a particularly seductive one, because it feels like accountability while actually functioning as another rehearsal, another pass through the same well-worn groove, this time labeled self-improvement instead of self-doubt. The mechanism doesn't distinguish between a thought that sounds like growth and a thought that sounds like shame. It only registers frequency. If you spend the next month rehearsing how badly you've mismanaged your own mind, you will simply build a stronger pathway for that. What actually interrupts a loop is not force. Force is what you've already tried. The New Year's resolution. The sudden burst of discipline that lasts 11 days. Force treats the pathway as an enemy to defeat in a single confrontation. And pathways this well-built do not fall to single confrontations. What interrupts a loop is redirection, applied with the same patience and the same repetition that built the loop in the first place. You didn't create the pattern in a day. You won't dismantle it in one either. And anyone promising you otherwise is selling you a story, not a mechanism. Here is the only assignment this chapter is giving you, and it is deliberately small. Once today, when you notice a familiar thought beginning its familiar route, don't fight it and don't judge it. Just say silently to yourself, "There's the pathway." Nothing more. You are not trying to stop the car. You are simply learning for the first time to recognize that you are the one driving it. There's a reason this particular mechanism is so easy to miss in your own life while being obvious in someone else's. Watching another person's pattern costs you nothing. You have no stake in their story, no identity built on top of their conclusions, so you can see the shape of it clearly, almost instantly, the way you can spot a friend repeating her mother's exact words in an argument, while she remains completely unaware she's doing it. Your own pattern is expensive to see in the same way, because seeing it means admitting that a piece of what you've been calling reality was actually authored by you, out of raw material that could have been assembled differently. That admission costs something. It's supposed to. Nothing that actually changes a life arrives free. None of this requires you to become a different kind of person overnight, someone suddenly vigilant and self-aware in every waking moment. That expectation would collapse under its own weight within days, the same way every previous attempt did. What it requires is smaller and considerably more sustainable. Catching the pathway once, cleanly, and letting that single catch be enough for today. The mechanism doesn't care how long you've been running it. It only responds to what you do next, starting now, one repetition at a time, in exactly the same currency it was built with. Chapter 5. The Bill You Haven't Opened Yet. Nobody sends you an invoice for this. That's what makes it dangerous. If the cost of the loop arrived as a single number on a single day, you'd have dealt with it already. Instead, it arrives the way real damage almost always arrives, in installments so small you never notice any one of them, until you look up one day, and the total has quietly become your whole life. You know this feeling if you've ever finally looked at your finances after months of not looking, and the number wasn't shocking because of one bad decision. It was shocking because of hundreds of small, individually defensible ones, none of which felt like anything in the moment they were made. That's not how you handle money. That's how the loop handles everything. Here's the first cost. And it's the one you feel but rarely name. Time spent rehearsing instead of living. Every minute you spend replaying an old conversation, refining an argument nobody's going to hear, defending a position in an imaginary courtroom where you're both the accused and the entire jury, is a minute stolen from a present moment that will never happen again in exactly this form. You are not lazy for losing hours to this. You are simply spending your most non-renewable resource on a loop that was never going to reach a verdict, because the courtroom exists only inside you and adjourns only when you decide to walk out of it. The second cost runs deeper, and it's harder to see because it doesn't show up as lost time. It shows up as narrowed possibility. Every time you rehearse a belief about your limits, you're not just wasting a moment. You're voting for a future in which that belief gets to keep deciding what you attempt. The job you didn't apply for because some old pathway told you the outcome before you tried. The conversation you didn't start because you'd already run the rejection in your head so many times that the real rejection, if it ever came, would almost feel familiar. You didn't lose those opportunities to bad luck. You priced yourself out of them before anyone else got the chance to. This is the part that deserves to sting a little, because comfort at this stage would just be another form of the same avoidance you named back in Chapter 2. The loop is not simply costing you outcomes. It's costing you the specific, irreplaceable version of your life that could have existed if your attention had gone somewhere else these last several years. That version doesn't get refunded. It doesn't wait patiently in storage for you to get around to it eventually. It closes, quietly, the way a door closes in another room while you're busy in this one. And you don't hear it shut because you were never listening for it. Consider your relationships for a moment, since the loop rarely stays contained to one area of a life. A pattern of thought convinced you, somewhere along the way, that people eventually leave, or that your needs are too much, or that safety means staying quiet about what actually hurts. You didn't test that belief once and confirm it. You built a life that quietly protected the belief from ever being tested, choosing partners who would eventually prove it right, staying silent in the exact moments that would have given someone the chance to prove it wrong. The loop doesn't just predict your life. Left alone long enough, it starts producing the very evidence it needs to keep running. Here's a distinction worth sitting with. There's a difference between paying a price and paying interest. A price is a single transaction, felt once, then finished. Interest compounds, quietly, invisibly, for as long as the underlying debt goes unaddressed. Everything discussed in this chapter is interest, not a price. The original thought that started the pathway, whatever it was, whenever it began, was a single moment. What you're living with now is decades of compounding, and compounding on a debt is far more expensive than the debt itself ever was. You might want proof that changing the pattern actually changes the balance, and that's a reasonable thing to want. But there's a trap hiding inside that request, because waiting for proof before you begin is simply the loop's latest disguise, its most sophisticated one yet, dressed up as caution instead of fear. The loop is fluent in the language of reasonable. It has had years to study exactly which arguments will keep you standing still, and demanding certainty before you'll move is one of its favorites, because certainty about a future that doesn't exist yet is never actually available to anyone. And the loop knows that better than you do. So here's what this chapter is asking you to sit with, without demanding you do anything about it yet. Somewhere in your life right now, there's a specific area where the bill has been accumulating longest. You already know which one it is. It surfaced the moment you started reading this chapter. A name, a number, a version of yourself you stopped pursuing years ago without ever formally deciding to give it up. That's the debt this book is eventually going to help you close. Not today, not by force. But it starts by admitting the balance is real, that it's been growing while you weren't looking, and that every day you spend still calling it fine is another day added to a total you'll eventually have to face. There's a useful way to picture this that makes the abstract mechanics feel less like theory and more like something you can watch happen in real time. Imagine two paths worn into a hillside after a rainstorm, one wide and deep from years of water running the same route, one barely a scratch in the dirt, brand new. Pour a bucket of water at the top of that hill, and it will follow the deep path almost every time, not because the deep path leads anywhere better, but because it simply requires less resistance to travel. Your mind works the same way with thought. The old pathway isn't winning because it's true. It's winning because it's deep, and depth, on its own, has nothing to do with where a path actually leads. This is also why insight alone has never been enough to change you, no matter how sharp or accurate that insight was. Understanding a pathway intellectually doesn't weaken it structurally, any more than understanding gravity lets you walk through a wall. The pathway responds to one thing only, and it isn't comprehension. It's repetition, applied in the opposite direction, patiently, for long enough that a new road finally becomes as easy to travel as the old one. You haven't been careless. You've been operating the only way anyone taught you how to operate, inside a mechanism nobody sat you down and explained. But ignorance and unwillingness aren't the same thing, and you're no longer the person who didn't know. The cost has a name now. The only question left is how much longer you're willing to let the interest run before you finally open the account and look. Chapter 6. Why It Never Held. You've tried before, it cansa. Let's not pretend otherwise, because pretending is just another version of the same avoidance. And you're past that now. There was a January, or a Monday, or a morning after a bad conversation, when you decided with real conviction that this was going to be different. You had a plan. You had motivation. For a while, maybe a week, maybe 3, it worked. And then it didn't. And the pattern folded back over the small gains like water closing over a stone. You've probably filed that under failure. Not enough discipline. Not enough willpower. Not enough of whatever quality other people seem to have, and you seem to lack. That filing is wrong, and it's worth taking apart carefully because the story you tell about why past attempts failed determines whether you'll even try the next one. Here's what actually happened. You tried to change the output of the loop while leaving the loop itself completely untouched. You attacked the behavior, the late-night scrolling, the second glass of wine, the silence instead of the honest conversation, without ever addressing the pathway generating the behavior in the first place. That's not a discipline problem. That's an engineering problem. And no amount of willpower fixes an engineering problem, because willpower and pathway strength are not even competing in the same arena. Think of it like this. The pathway you built over years operates automatically, beneath conscious awareness, the way your heartbeat operates without requiring your permission. Willpower lives entirely in conscious awareness, a much smaller, much more exhausting system that runs on a finite daily supply. You were essentially trying to hold back an automatic process, using a resource that depletes within hours. Of course it broke. It was always going to break. The surprising thing isn't that your resolve failed by week 3. The surprising thing is that conscious effort held the line as long as it did against a mechanism that never gets tired, never clocks out, and has had years of practice running exactly this route. There's a second reason past attempts collapsed, quieter than the first and considerably harder to admit. Some part of you didn't fully want the change to hold. Not because you enjoy the pain of the pattern, but because the pattern, however costly, is at least familiar, and familiarity has always read as safety to the part of your mind responsible for keeping you alive rather than fulfilled. A known unhappiness will consistently beat an unknown happiness in that particular calculation, every single time, unless something changes about how the calculation itself gets made. You felt this the moment things started going well, didn't you? The relationship that finally felt steady, and some quiet static started up underneath it. A restlessness you couldn't quite name. The project that finally started gaining traction, right before you found a reason to pull back from it. That wasn't self-sabotage in the way people usually mean the term, some flaw designed to keep you small. That was the pathway recognizing unfamiliar territory and pulling you back toward the road it already knew, the same way a hand returns to a phone in a silent room, not because the phone offers anything good, but because the silence itself has become unbearable to the pattern that's used to noise. Here's a distinction that will save you from repeating this exact failure a fifth time. There's a difference between motivation and structure. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings are weather, unreliable, seasonal, gone by Thursday for reasons that have nothing to do with your character. Structure is an environment engineered so that the right action happens even on the days the feeling doesn't show up. Every attempt you've made that relied on motivation was, by definition, temporary, because you built it on the one resource guaranteed to fluctuate. You didn't fail at the goal. You built the entire attempt on the wrong material. You also very likely tried to change everything at once. The full overhaul. New routine, new mindset, new version of yourself, launched on a single Monday with the force of a person trying to outrun their own history in one sprint. That approach fails almost every time. Not because you lack ambition, but because a pathway built over years through thousands of small repetitions cannot be dismantled by a single large decision. Loops don't yield to intensity. They yield to frequency, the same currency that built them in the first place. You cannot out-intensity something that was constructed entirely out of repetition. Sit with something honest for a moment. None of your past attempts were failures of character. Every one of them was an experiment run with an incomplete map, using tools that were never built for this specific job. You brought willpower to a problem that required architecture. You brought intensity to a problem that required patience. You brought a single decision to a problem that required 1,000 small ones, repeated without drama for longer than felt natural. This reframe matters more than it might seem to right now, because the story you've been carrying, that you're someone who starts things and doesn't finish them, is itself just another pathway, built the same way every other one in this book has been built, through repetition and confirmation. Every time you cite a past attempt as proof of your unreliability, you strengthen a belief that then goes looking for evidence to support it, and finds it, and hands it back to you as further proof. You have been building a case against your own capacity to change, using the very mechanism this book is teaching you to recognize. That case is not evidence. It's residue. And residue, however old, however thick, is not load-bearing. It only feels that way because you've never tried removing it with the right tool. Consider what economists call the sunk cost, applied here to something more personal than money. The longer you've run a pattern, the more tempting it becomes to keep running it simply to justify the years already spent inside it. As if changing course now would somehow retroactively waste everything that came before. It wouldn't. The years already spent are already spent regardless of what you do next. The only real question left is whether the next decade gets added to the same total, or spent building something else entirely. Treating the past as a reason to keep paying is exactly how interest compounds in the first place, and exactly how people end up 70 years old, still defending a decision they made, half-consciously, at 22. There's a version of this cost that shows up specifically in the body, worth naming before we move on. Years of unexamined pattern don't just narrow what you attempt. They accumulate as tension, as the specific ache in a jaw that clenches every night without your permission, as the shallow breath that's become so normal, you've forgotten what a full one feels like. The mind was never going to carry this debt alone. It always finds a way to hand part of the bill to the body, and the body always pays it, quietly, for as long as you let it. The tool isn't bigger willpower. It was never going to be. What actually works starts smaller than you'd expect, small enough that it won't trigger the part of you that pulls back from unfamiliar territory, and steady enough that it doesn't depend on a feeling that might not show up on any given Tuesday. That's where we're headed next, and for the first time in this book, we start building instead of examining. Chapter 7. The Fragment That Survives. Forget the overhaul. You've already seen where that leads. What you need instead is something almost embarrassingly small, small enough to survive contact with a bad day, a bad mood, a canceled plan, a fight with someone you love, small enough that the part of you built to protect the old pathway doesn't even register it as a threat worth resisting. Here's the fragment. One thought, chosen deliberately, held for 90 seconds once a day, at the same moment every day. That's the entire beginning. Not a morning routine. Not a 5-step protocol. One thought, one window, one repetition, small enough to feel almost insulting given the size of what you're trying to undo. You'll want to make it bigger. That instinct is worth naming out loud, because it's the same instinct that sank every previous attempt. The mind, faced with a problem this large, wants a solution that matches its scale, because a small solution feels like it's underestimating the size of the debt. But you already know what happens to solutions built to match the scale of the problem. They collapse under their own weight by week 3, exactly like the last one did, and the one before that. The fragment works for a completely different reason than intensity ever could. Remember the mechanism from Chapter 4. A pathway strengthens through repetition, not through force. It doesn't care how much emotional weight you put behind a single attempt. It only tracks frequency, the number of times a thought gets rehearsed, regardless of how loudly or quietly that rehearsal happens. This means a small, boring, consistent thought, repeated daily, will eventually outcompete a dramatic, exhausting effort that only shows up twice before collapsing. You are not trying to win one enormous confrontation. You are trying to accumulate enough small repetitions that a new pathway becomes, eventually, the path of least resistance. Here's how to choose the thought, because this matters more than people expect it to. It cannot be the opposite of the old belief, stated as an affirmation you don't yet believe. If your pathway has spent a decade insisting you're bad with money, standing in front of a mirror telling yourself you're wealthy and abundant will not work. And you already know this, because some part of you will simply laugh at the sentence the moment it's spoken. The mind rejects claims that contradict the evidence it spent years accumulating. What it accepts, slowly, is a thought specific enough and modest enough to feel almost undeniably true the first time you think it. Not, I am wealthy. Something closer to the ground. I am someone who looks directly at numbers instead of away from them. That sentence doesn't ask you to believe something extraordinary. It only asks you to notice a specific achievable behavior and claim it as identity. And because it's modest enough to be true, the mind doesn't fight it. It simply lets it in, and once a thought gets in without resistance, repetition can finally begin doing its work. Choose yours the same way. Look at the debt you named back in Chapter 5, the specific area where the interest has been compounding longest, and find the smallest, most honest fragment of a different identity you could plant there. Not the finished version of the person you want to become. Just the first true sentence on the way there. If the pattern has convinced you that you're someone people eventually leave, the fragment isn't, I am deeply lovable, stated to an empty room that doesn't believe you yet. It might be closer to, I am someone learning to stay in the room when things get honest, modest, specific. True enough today to survive its own repetition. Now, the timing. 90 seconds, once daily, at the same moment. The same moment matters more than people expect, because consistency of timing does something consistency of duration alone cannot. It attaches the new thought to an existing, already automatic cue in your day. Brushing your teeth, the first sip of coffee, the walk from the car to the front door. You are not asking your mind to remember a new habit from nothing. You are asking it to piggyback a small new signal onto a route it already runs without thinking, which means the fragment gets carried along even on days your motivation doesn't show up at all. This is structure, the thing Chapter 6 named as the actual solution, built at last, in its smallest possible form. Here's what will happen, and it's worth knowing in advance, so you don't mistake it for failure. For the first several days, the fragment will feel like nothing. No shift, no breakthrough. Nothing you could point to and call proof. You might even feel a small flicker of contempt for how insignificant it seems. 90 seconds, one sentence, against years of compounding damage. That flicker is the old pathway, still fully intact, still running at full strength, evaluating the new fragment against its own scale and finding it laughably small. Let it think that. It's wrong, and it will keep being wrong for exactly as long as it takes repetition to do what repetition always eventually does. Somewhere around the second or third week, something will shift. Not dramatically, but noticeably. A moment where the old thought starts to arrive and, for half a second, the new fragment gets there first. That half second is the entire game. That's not a small event dressed up as significant. That is mechanically, precisely, the pathway beginning to compete for the same real estate the old one used to occupy alone. You won't feel transformed. You'll feel a flicker of something unfamiliar. A sentence that used to arrive automatically arriving half a beat late for the first time in years. Notice it when it happens. Don't rush past it looking for something bigger. That flicker is the proof you were asking for back in Chapter 5. You are not rebuilding your entire life this week. You are laying one board across a gap that's been open for years, and one board is enough to start crossing, even if it isn't enough yet to call it a bridge. The rest gets built the same way this one did, one repetition at a time, at the same hour, every day, whether or not the day feels like it deserves it. Here's one more failure pattern worth naming plainly, because it's common enough that you've likely lived it more than once. Outsourcing the structure entirely to someone else, a coach, a partner, an app, and mistaking their accountability for your own. Borrowed structure works exactly as long as the other person is watching, and collapses the moment they stop, because nothing about it was ever actually installed in you. This isn't an argument against support. It's a warning about where the real engine has to live. The fragment ahead only works if the structure belongs to you, small enough to carry on your own, without needing anyone else in the room to make it real. Start tomorrow, at whatever hour already has a habit attached to it. Choose the sentence tonight before you sleep, so it's waiting for you instead of something you have to invent under pressure in the morning. 90 seconds, one sentence. That's the whole assignment. And it is exactly as small as it needs to be to actually survive. Chapter 8. The Pushback. It starts working and then something in you objects. Not loudly, not at first. It shows up as a strange irritability 3 days in. A flatness where you expected relief. A small voice muttering that this is stupid. That 90 seconds a day was never going to fix anything. That you're wasting time on a sentence while the real problems sit untouched. You'll be tempted to take that voice at face value, to treat it as a fair critique arriving at a reasonable moment. It isn't. It's the pathway, and it has just noticed it's losing ground. This is worth naming precisely, because almost nobody warns you that this stage exists, and its absence from most self-help conversations is exactly why so many people quit here, mistaking a predictable phase for proof that the whole approach failed. Resistance is not a sign you're doing this wrong. Resistance is a sign the old pathway has detected competition for the first time in years, and it is responding the only way it knows how, by making the new behavior feel harder, less meaningful, less worth continuing than it did on day one. Understand what's actually happening underneath the irritability. For years, maybe decades, the old pattern ran unopposed, the only road available, requiring no defense because nothing was contesting it. The moment you introduced a fragment, however small, you created the first real contest that pathway has faced in a long time. And contested systems, whether in a mind or an ecosystem or a market, don't yield quietly. They escalate. This is not a metaphor about willpower failing you again. This is the literal mechanical shape of what change feels like from the inside, every time, for everyone. And knowing that in advance is the difference between mistaking it for defeat and recognizing it for what it actually is. Evidence of progress disguised as evidence of failure. You'll feel this resistance in specific recognizable forms, and it helps to know their shapes before they arrive. The first is sudden reasonableness. A perfectly logical case will present itself for why today is different, why the timing is off, why you'll simply do it twice tomorrow to make up for it. That case will sound completely sound in the moment. It is not sound. It is the oldest trick the pattern has, because it doesn't need to convince you that change is wrong, only that skipping it once, just this once, is harmless. It is never just once. You already know that from every diet, every resolution, every promise that started with just this once and ended somewhere much further from where it began. The second form is comparison. You'll catch yourself measuring the fragment against people who seem to have it figured out already. People who never needed 90 seconds and a sentence, because they were simply born less broken than you. This comparison is not information. It's the pattern reaching for the oldest weapon in its arsenal. The belief that you are fundamentally behind, fundamentally deficient, and therefore not worth this investment. Notice it, name it, and refuse to let it set the agenda. You have no accurate information about anyone else's internal machinery. You only have information about yours, and yours is currently doing exactly what every mind does when a new pathway starts competing with an old one. The third form is the most convincing because it wears the costume of wisdom. It sounds like maturity, like finally being realistic, like admitting that maybe this was never going to change, and the healthier thing is to accept yourself as you are, instead of chasing some fantasy of transformation. There is real wisdom in acceptance, and this book has no argument with it. But notice the timing of when that particular wisdom always seems to arrive, exactly at the moment real movement starts. Never during the years the pattern ran unexamined and unopposed. Acceptance that shows up only when change gets difficult isn't peace. It's retreat, dressed carefully enough to pass as insight. Here's what actually helps during this stage, and it isn't more effort. It's expectation set correctly in advance. Resistance of this kind typically peaks somewhere between the first and third week. Exactly. The window most attempts historically collapsed in, back when you didn't know this stage was coming and mistook it for proof the whole thing was pointless. Now you know. The muttering voice on day 11 is not new information about whether this works. It's a predictable weather pattern, arriving on schedule, and weather passes whether or not you rearrange your life around it. There's a distinction worth holding here, one that will keep you steady through this stage and every stage after it. The difference between resistance and a genuine signal. A genuine signal tells you something true about your direction, that a specific action is actually harming you, that a specific goal was never actually yours to begin with. Resistance tells you nothing about direction. It only tells you that something is changing, and change, regardless of whether it's good or bad, always registers as threat to a system built primarily around stability. You can learn to tell these apart by asking a single question in the moment. Does this feeling contain new information, or does it contain the same objection I've heard 100 times before, in a slightly different outfit? If it's the same objection, it's resistance. Let it pass through the room without offering it a chair. You don't fight resistance by arguing with it. Arguing gives it exactly the engagement it's designed to provoke, another round of attention, which is the one resource that strengthens any pathway, including the resistance itself. What actually works is smaller and stranger than fighting. You simply continue the fragment anyway, on the day the resistance is loudest, without giving the voice the dignity of a rebuttal. 90 seconds. The same sentence. Especially today. Especially because today is when it would be easiest to stop. And stopping today is precisely what the old pattern is angling for. This is the day that actually counts. Not the easy days, when the fragment felt natural and required nothing from you. The day the resistance shows up loud and reasonable and dressed as wisdom, and you do the 90 seconds anyway, quietly, without ceremony, is the day the new pathway earns real ground against the old one. Every pattern you've ever built, the ones working against you and the ones that could work for you, was built the same way. Through the moments nobody was watching, where you chose the smaller, quieter action over the louder, more convincing voice in the room. One more piece of this worth understanding before you start. The fragment isn't asking you to feel anything in particular while you say it. You don't need conviction on day one. You don't need to believe the sentence with your whole chest before it's allowed to count. Belief in this process is not the starting condition. It's the eventual result of enough honest repetition, arriving quietly, later, after the pathway has had time to form. Waiting to feel ready before you begin is simply one more disguise for the same old avoidance, dressed up as self-awareness instead of fear. The voice will get quieter after this stage, not gone. It rarely disappears completely, but quieter and less convincing and easier to recognize on sight the next time it shows up wearing a new outfit. You are not trying to silence it forever in 1 week. You are simply trying to survive the loudest version of it once, on purpose, so you know exactly what to do the next time it arrives. Chapter 9. The day nothing is on your side. There will be a day, and it's coming, when none of this feels reasonable to keep doing. You'll wake up already behind, already tired in a way sleep didn't touch, carrying some combination of a bad night, a hard conversation, a body that aches in the specific way exhaustion aches. On that day, the 90 seconds will feel like the least important thing in a life that's demanding far more urgent things from you, and you will be tempted, with real justification, to let it go. Just for today. This chapter exists because that day matters more than every easy day combined. Here's why. A pathway built on good days only, when energy is high and conditions are favorable, isn't actually a new pathway. It's a performance of one, dependent entirely on circumstances lining up in your favor, which means it collapses the instant circumstances stop cooperating. Exactly the way every previous attempt collapsed the first time life got difficult. The pattern you're trying to displace didn't build itself only on your good days. It built itself relentlessly, on every kind of day. Which is precisely why it's strong enough to run automatically now. If your new fragment only survives favorable conditions, it will never actually compete with something that was constructed to survive all of them. This is the day the old pattern tries hardest to reclaim its ground, and it's worth understanding exactly why low energy is its preferred terrain. Everything this book has described, the noticing, the pausing, the choosing of a smaller thought over an automatic one, requires a certain amount of conscious bandwidth to execute. Exhaustion is precisely the condition that depletes conscious bandwidth fastest, which means exhaustion is exactly when automatic processes, the old, deeply grooved pathway among them, take over by default. The pattern isn't smarter on hard days, it's simply less contested, because you have less capacity left to contest it with. Knowing this changes what today is actually asking of you. It was never asking for your best effort. Your best effort was never going to be available on a day like this. And expecting it of yourself is just another way the old story about failure and inadequacy sneaks back in through the side door. Today isn't asking you to feel motivated or clear or hopeful about the process. Today is asking for something much smaller and much more durable. The same 90 seconds, executed with whatever depleted, unglamorous energy you actually have available, exactly as scheduled, exactly as small as always. This is the moment to remember the distinction from Chapter 6, the one between motivation and structure. Motivation was never going to show up today. It doesn't work on a schedule, and expecting it here is expecting weather to behave like a calendar. Structure doesn't ask for a feeling. Structure asks only that you follow the same route at the same hour, regardless of what's happening inside you. Which is exactly why it survives days like this one, when nothing else would. There's a particular kind of low that deserves separate attention here, distinct from ordinary tiredness. Some days the exhaustion isn't physical. It's the low that comes after disappointment, after a plan falls through, after you catch yourself, mid-argument, saying the exact thing the old pattern would have said, and the discouragement that follows feels like proof that none of this new work actually took. This is the moment most people quietly abandon the process, not because the fragment failed, but because a single relapse into old behavior gets treated as evidence that the entire project was a fantasy from the beginning. Here's the distinction that matters most on a day like this. A lapse and a collapse are not the same event, even though they feel identical in the moment. A lapse is a single instance, a moment where the old pathway won a round. It's had years of practice winning. A collapse is the decision, made in the emotional aftermath of that single round, to stop showing up entirely. The lapse was never the dangerous part. It was always going to happen occasionally, for a while, because a pathway that strong doesn't lose every round just because a new competitor has entered the field. The collapse is the only part that actually undoes progress, and the collapse is a choice, made after the lapse, not a consequence of it. You get to make a different choice than the one the disappointment is arguing for. Tonight, when the low hits hardest, when the argument for skipping the fragment sounds most reasonable, most deserved, most like basic self-compassion after a hard day, do the 90 seconds anyway. Not as punishment, not as proof you're tough enough to push through anything. Do it because a fragment survived on a day like this is worth more, structurally, than 10 fragments completed on easy days when nothing was asking anything of you. There's something else happening on days like this that's easy to miss while you're inside them. Every time you follow the small structure through genuine difficulty, you're not just maintaining a habit. You're teaching your own mind something it has likely never learned before, that you are someone who follows through specifically when it's hard, not only when it's convenient. That lesson doesn't get taught on easy days. It can only be taught here, in exactly this kind of exhaustion. And once it's been taught even once, it becomes part of the evidence your mind uses to build the next version of who you believe yourself to be. It helps to remember in the middle of this stage that resistance this loud is actually a form of feedback you asked for. You wanted the old pattern disturbed. This is what disturbance sounds like from the inside. Not silence, not immediate relief, but noise, friction. A system objecting to losing territory it assumed was permanently settled. Mistaking that noise for evidence of failure is the single most common reason good attempts get abandoned exactly when they were closest to holding. It's worth remembering, too, that resistance rarely escalates in a straight line. It tends to spike hardest right before it breaks, the way a held breath gets most uncomfortable in the second, right before you finally exhale. If day 11 or day 14 feels like the loudest the voice has ever been, that's not a sign you're losing ground. Statistically, structurally, it's often the closest you've been to the moment it finally quiets down. That steadiness compounds too, the same way the debt from Chapter 5 compounded, except now it's compounding in your favor, a quiet reserve you didn't have access to the first time a day like this one arrived. Nothing about that steadiness needs to be dramatic to count. You don't need to feel strong today. You need to be small today, smaller than usual if that's what today requires. 90 seconds, the same sentence, delivered without any of the energy or conviction you'd prefer to have behind it. The sentence doesn't need your conviction to keep working. It only needs your repetition, and repetition is available to you even now, even like this, even on a day when almost nothing else is. Chapter 10. When someone else is watching. You've done this quietly so far, and quiet has been its own kind of safety. Nobody's questioned the 90 seconds because nobody knows about them. Nobody's watched you catch yourself mid-pattern and choose differently, because it's happened in the privacy of your own head, where no one gets to weigh in. That privacy has been useful. It's also about to be tested, because change that stays entirely private rarely stays change for long. Eventually, other people notice, and the moment they do, the entire mechanism gets more complicated. Here's something nobody prepares you for. The people closest to you built parts of their own stability around the old version of you. Not out of malice, out of the same mechanism this whole book has been describing. Their minds formed pathways too, predictions about how you'll respond, what you'll tolerate, where your limits sit, and those predictions became part of the architecture they used to navigate their own lives. When you change, even for the better, even in a direction you know is right, you are quietly demanding that they update a model of you they've been relying on, often for years. Some of them will do that willingly. Some won't. And their resistance will rarely announce itself honestly. You'll recognize it by its shape more than its words. The friend who suddenly needs you to reassure her that you haven't changed, not really that you're still the same person underneath. The family member who responds to your steadiness with a needling comment about how you think you're better than everyone now. The partner who seems oddly unsettled by a version of you that stopped absorbing conflict the way you used to, who almost seems to miss the old friction, because at least the old friction was familiar terrain. None of these responses are usually conscious sabotage. They're the same automatic pathway mechanism this book described in Chapter 4. Just running in someone else's mind instead of yours. Defending a prediction they built about you the same way you built predictions about yourself. This is where a distinction becomes essential, because without it, you'll either abandon the changes to keep the peace, or you'll harden into someone who treats every relationship as an obstacle to route around. The distinction is this: their discomfort is real, but it is not automatically your responsibility to resolve. You can hold both of those facts at once. Somebody's unease with your growth is genuine, understandable, even sympathetic, given everything Chapter 4 taught you about how pathways work. It is not, however, evidence that you should shrink back to the version of yourself that made them comfortable. Comfort built on your stagnation was never actually stability. It was just familiarity wearing stability's clothes. You'll be tested most by the people who knew you longest, because they have the deepest pathway invested in the old prediction. A stranger meeting you today has no old version to grieve. Someone who's known you for 15 years has 15 years of accumulated expectation. And expectation, once it's had that long to compound, doesn't dissolve just because you've become someone slightly steadier, slightly more honest, slightly less available to absorb what you used to absorb without complaint. Expect some friction here specifically, and don't mistake it for proof that the relationship or the change was a mistake. There's a second dynamic worth naming, subtler than resistance and in some ways more dangerous. Because it doesn't feel like an attack at all, it's the performance trap. Once someone notices you're working on yourself, there's a pull to demonstrate the change for their benefit, to prove the 90 seconds are working by visibly, audibly being better in front of them. This is a quiet corruption of the entire process, because the moment the fragment starts serving an audience instead of the pathway it was actually built to address, it stops being structure and starts being theater. Theater collapses the instant the audience looks away, which is precisely why change that only exists to be witnessed rarely survives being alone again. Keep the fragment private for as long as it needs to remain private. You don't owe anyone documentation of your progress, and explaining yourself to people who haven't asked, who are simply watching you differently now, often invites exactly the kind of scrutiny that turns quiet growth into a performance you'll eventually resent maintaining. Let the results speak, slowly, without narration. People will notice a genuine shift in how you carry a room far more than they'll believe a verbal account of one. Now, the more encouraging half of this chapter. Some people will meet your steadiness with something unexpected: relief. Not everyone in your life has been invested in your old pattern. Some of them have been quietly waiting longer than you realized for you to stop absorbing what you used to absorb, to stop apologizing for needs you used to apologize for, to finally take up the exact amount of space you were always entitled to. These relationships tend to deepen exactly when the difficult ones start showing strain, and the contrast between the two is often the clearest evidence you'll get that the change is real, because it's producing two different, honest reactions instead of one uniform response that could just be politeness. Pay close attention to which category a given relationship falls into, because it tells you something important that has nothing to do with the other person's character and everything to do with what the relationship was actually built on. A relationship that only worked when you were smaller was never built on you. It was built on your absence from your own life, and losing access to that particular dynamic, and however painful in the short term, is not a cost of this process. It's one of its earliest, most honest returns. There's a particular trap worth naming for days exactly like this one. The belief that today doesn't count because conditions were unfair, so tomorrow under better conditions will somehow count more. This sounds reasonable, and it isn't, because the pathway you're building doesn't grade on a curve. It doesn't care that today was harder than most days. It only registers whether the repetition happened or didn't. A fragment completed under difficult conditions carries exactly the same structural weight as one completed on an easy afternoon. And in a strange counterintuitive way, it often carries more because it proves the structure survives precisely the conditions it was built to survive. Notice, too, what happens the following morning, after a day exactly like this one gets survived instead of abandoned. There's a specific, quiet steadiness available the next day that wasn't available before, not because the exhaustion vanished overnight, but because some part of you now carries proof, gathered firsthand, that the structure holds even when nothing else does. You are not responsible for managing everyone else's pathway while you're busy rebuilding your own. You can be gentle with their discomfort without becoming its custodian. The fragment continues either way, at the same hour, regardless of who's watching or who isn't, or who liked the old version of you better. That fragment was never built for an audience. It was built for the one relationship this entire book has actually been about from the first page, the one between you and the mind you're finally learning to run on purpose. Chapter 11. Where it actually started. You've been working with the pattern for 10 chapters now without asking where it came from, and that's been deliberate. Origin stories are seductive. They offer somewhere to point, someone to explain, a moment that supposedly accounts for everything that followed. But origin without ownership becomes just another form of the denial named back in Chapter 2, a sophisticated one, dressed up as insight. So before we go looking for the root, understand exactly what we're looking for it and what we are not. We are not looking for someone to blame. We are looking for information, because a pattern makes far more sense and becomes far easier to finally release once you understand the specific conditions that made it necessary in the first place. Here's what almost nobody tells you about early patterns. They were never irrational. Every pathway you're working to loosen right now was, at the moment it formed, the single most intelligent adaptation available to the mind that built it. You didn't develop the belief that your needs were too much because you were broken. You developed it because, at some point, in some room, expressing a need produced a consequence painful enough that a much younger, much more dependent version of you concluded, correctly, given the available evidence, that silence was safer. That conclusion wasn't a flaw. It was a survival calculation, made with total accuracy, using the only data that child had access to. This distinction matters enormously, because most people, once they start tracing a pattern backward, either collapse into blaming a parent, a circumstance, an entire childhood, or swing hard in the opposite direction and insist none of it mattered, that dwelling on the past is simply an excuse. Both of those are dead ends. Blame keeps you facing backward, waiting for an apology or a correction that may never come, and that you don't actually need in order to move forward. Dismissal keeps you facing the pattern without ever understanding why it's proven so difficult to dislodge, treating a deeply rooted structure as though it were a simple bad habit that discipline alone should have fixed by now. The useful position sits between those two, and it's less comfortable than either extreme because it doesn't offer anywhere to rest. The useful position says, this pattern made sense once, given who built it and what it was protecting, and it no longer serves the adult currently carrying it. And both of those things are true simultaneously, without contradiction. Consider how patterns actually take root. A child doesn't reason her way into a belief the way an adult does, weighing evidence, considering alternatives. A child absorbs pattern the way skin absorbs temperature, immediately, wholesale, without the capacity to question the source. If the emotional climate of an early home was unpredictable, a child doesn't conclude the climate was unpredictable. She concludes something about herself, that she must have done something to cause the instability, because a child's mind, still developing the capacity for complex causal reasoning, defaults to self-blame far more readily than it defaults to blaming the adults she depends on for survival. Blaming the adult is dangerous because dependence requires trust in the adult's basic reliability. Blaming herself, however painful, at least leaves the world explainable and the adult intact. This is why so many adult patterns trace back to conclusions that sound almost absurd when stated plainly, and yet operate with total authority underneath conscious awareness for decades. I must not have been worth staying for. I must have been too much. I must have needed less than I actually needed because needing more clearly wasn't going to be met. Nobody chose these conclusions consciously. A much younger mind built them out of necessity, using the only tools available at the time, and then handed them to you, fully formed, packaged as fact rather than interpretation, somewhere around an age too young to know the difference. Here's why the pattern survived so long after the original conditions that produced it disappeared. Pathways don't come with expiration dates. They don't check periodically whether the circumstances that justified them are still active. A belief formed at 7 continues operating at 35 with exactly the same authority it had originally, because nothing in the mechanism itself prompts a review. You have been, in a very real sense, taking instructions from a 7-year-old's best available conclusion for the last several decades, not because you're foolish, but because nobody ever taught either of you that conclusions need to be revisited once the evidence that produced them has changed. This is where the distinction between victim and villain finally becomes useless, because neither framing survives contact with how minds actually form under pressure. The adults who shaped your earliest patterns were very likely operating under pathways of their own, built the same way yours were built, inherited from people who inherited theirs the same way. This doesn't excuse harm that happened. It contextualizes it, and contextualizing harm is not the same as forgiving it or minimizing it. It's simply recognizing that you are not the only person in this chain who was running an inherited program without ever being shown the wiring. You get to hold sadness about this without staying there. There is something genuinely worth grieving in discovering that a belief governing 30 years of decisions was built by someone too young to know better, using information that stopped being accurate before you can even remember. Let that grief move through you honestly. Rushing past it in favor of premature positivity just buries it somewhere it will keep operating anyway. The same way everything else in this book has shown you that unexamined material keeps operating whether or not you're looking at it directly. But grief has a shelf life that blame doesn't, if you let it complete instead of interrupting it. Once you've actually felt the sadness of where the pattern came from, rather than analyzing it from a safe intellectual distance, something shifts that analysis alone never accomplishes. The pattern stops feeling like an eternal truth about who you are, and starts feeling like what it actually always was, a very old conclusion, made by someone very young, Using information that expired a long time ago, there's a particular kind of loneliness worth naming here, one that surprises people who expected this stage to feel triumphant instead. Outgrowing a pattern sometimes means outgrowing the specific shape of a relationship built entirely around that pattern. And that loss is real even when the change itself was good, even when you know, with total clarity, that staying smaller was never actually the answer. Let yourself feel that loss without treating it as proof you made a mistake. Growth is rarely tidy. It usually costs something on the way to being worth it, and pretending otherwise only makes the cost harder to carry when it eventually arrives. You are not that 7-year-old anymore. You have information she didn't have, resources she didn't have, a nervous system with capacities hers hadn't developed yet. The conclusion she reached kept you safe long enough to become the person reading this sentence right now. And that alone deserves acknowledgement rather than resentment. But her conclusion doesn't have to keep making your decisions simply because it's had a long, uncontested run. She did her job. It's time you did yours. Chapter 12. Why Progress Disappears. You'll have a good stretch. It's coming if it hasn't started already. Weeks where the fragment feels less like an assignment and more like simply who you are. Where the old pathway goes quiet for long enough that you almost forget it was ever running the show. And then without any single dramatic event you could point to, it starts slipping. Not collapsing, slipping. A skipped day here, a rushed sentence there. Until one morning you notice you haven't done the 90 seconds in over a week, and you can't quite remember deciding to stop. This chapter exists because that moment is not a personal failure. It's a structural one, and structural problems have structural solutions, not moral ones. Here's what actually happens during a good stretch, and it's almost the opposite of what it feels like from the inside. When the new pathway starts winning consistently, the sense of urgency that built it in the first place quietly evaporates. You stopped hurting as acutely, so the reason for the 90 seconds stopped feeling as vivid, and a routine that was originally protected by real pain gradually loses its guard the moment the pain recedes. This isn't weakness. It's simply how urgency works. Urgency is a powerful builder and an unreliable maintainer, because urgency, by definition, requires ongoing discomfort to sustain itself. And the entire point of the work was to reduce the discomfort that urgency depended on. This creates a strange trap that almost nobody warns you about. Success starts dismantling the very motivation that produced it. The better you feel, the less pressing the fragment seems, and the less pressing it seems, the more easily it slides out of the schedule that used to hold it in place. Left unaddressed, this isn't a hypothetical risk. It's close to a mechanical certainty, the same way muscle atrophies without ongoing use. Even after you've built real strength, even after the strength was hard-won and genuinely yours. The old pattern is aware of this dynamic even if you aren't, though awareness isn't quite the right word for something that operates below conscious intention. It doesn't need to overpower a strong new pathway directly. It only needs to wait for the moment your guard drops on its own, which good progress reliably produces. And then it doesn't need to fight its way back in. It simply reoccupies space you stopped actively defending. This is why relapse so often arrives disguised as reasonableness rather than crisis. It rarely announces itself as "I'm giving up." It arrives as "I've got this handled now. I don't need the structure anymore," which sounds like confidence and functions like an open door. The tragedy of this particular trap is that it's triggered by real progress, not by failure. Which means the better this work has been going, the more carefully you need to watch for exactly this moment. Here's the distinction that protects you here, and it's one most people never learn until they've relapsed several times and finally started paying attention to the pattern of their own relapses. Motivation and maintenance are entirely different systems, requiring entirely different fuel. Motivation, the fire that got this whole project started, runs on discomfort, on urgency, on the vivid memory of the cost named back in Chapter 5. Maintenance runs on something else completely, on structure that doesn't depend on how you feel about it, on systems built specifically to survive the exact moment your feelings stop cooperating. You cannot maintain anything valuable using the fuel that built it, because that fuel was never designed to run indefinitely. It was only ever designed to get something started. Practically, this means the fragment needs to survive its own success, and the way it survives is by becoming boring on purpose, rather than emotionally charged. Emotionally charged practices depend on emotional weather and weather changes. A boring, small scheduled practice, 90 seconds, same hour, regardless of how you feel about it that day, survives precisely because it was never asking anything of your feelings in the first place. If you notice the fragment starting to feel like something you do only when things feel urgent again, that's the exact signal to reinforce the structure immediately, not to wait for urgency to justify it once more. There's a second, quieter threat to progress worth naming here, distinct from the fading of urgency: isolation of success. Once the fragment starts working, there's a temptation to consider the work finished, to treat the 90 seconds as a debt now paid off rather than an ongoing practice with no natural endpoint. This mistake comes from misunderstanding what the fragment actually is. It was never a treatment with a completion date, the way a course of medication ends once the infection clears. It's closer to something structural, like a habit of posture, that stops mattering the instant you decide you've mastered it and no longer need to maintain it. Protecting progress, then, isn't about vigilance in the anxious sense, scanning constantly for danger, treating every good week as the beginning of an inevitable collapse. That kind of hypervigilance is exhausting, and, ironically, another form of the same old pattern wearing new clothes, still organized around fear rather than genuine stability. Real protection looks calmer than that. It looks like keeping the fragment scheduled at the same hour indefinitely, regardless of how unnecessary it starts to feel. The way you'd keep brushing your teeth even after your dentist stopped finding anything wrong. The absence of a problem was never a reason to abandon the practice that prevented it. It's worth pausing on how this shows up physically, because the body often understands the age of a pattern before the conscious mind is willing to admit it. Notice the specific quality of a reaction the next time an old belief gets triggered. The speed of it. The disproportion between the size of the current event and the size of the response it produces. That gap, the moment a small present-day slight produces an outsized flood of old feeling, is usually a reliable signal that you're not actually reacting to today. You're reacting to an unfinished conversation from decades ago that never got to say what it needed to say, using whatever today happens to offer as its nearest available microphone. There's a reason this chapter matters more than it might seem to on first read. Every pattern examined so far in this book eventually traces back to a room like the one just described. A moment, a conclusion, a much younger version of you doing her best with incomplete information. Understanding that origin doesn't excuse what happens next. It simply removes the last excuse for treating the pattern as some fixed, unchangeable feature of your character, rather than what it has always actually been. A decision, made a long time ago, by someone who no longer has to be the one making it. You will have stretches where this feels unnecessary, even silly 90 seconds, spent affirming something that already feels settled and obvious. Do it anyway. The moments it feels most unnecessary are, paradoxically, the moments it's doing its quietest, most important work, holding ground you've already won so thoroughly that you've started to forget it was ever contested. Progress that isn't actively maintained doesn't stay still. It erodes, slowly, the same way it was built. And the only real defense against that erosion is a structure boring enough and steady enough to keep running long after the reason you started has stopped feeling urgent. Chapter 13. Who You're Becoming Without Announcing It. Nobody hands you a certificate for this, There's no moment where a voice tells you the transformation is officially complete. No ceremony marking the exact day the old pattern stopped running your life and a new one took over. Identity doesn't change like that. It changes the way a coastline changes, wave by wave, so slowly that no single day shows you the difference. And yet, one day, you look at an old photograph of the shoreline and can't quite believe it's the same place. You've been laying down a different set of waves for a while now, 90 seconds at a time, on good days and terrible ones, in front of people who noticed and people who didn't. It's worth pausing here, not to celebrate prematurely, but to actually look at what's accumulating, because you likely haven't been tracking it. Nobody tracks a coastline changing while they're the one standing on it. Here's the mechanism worth understanding at this stage, because it explains why identity, once it shifts, becomes far more stable than any single motivated decision ever could. Chapter 4 described how a thought, repeated enough, builds a pathway strong enough to run automatically. What happens at this later stage is a further compression. The pathway stops feeling like a behavior you perform and starts feeling like a fact you simply are. You stopped being someone who's trying to stay calm during conflict and became someone who's generally calm during conflict, the effort quietly disappearing from something that once required visible, exhausting effort every time. This shift, from doing to being, is the actual target the entire book has been pointing toward, though it was never named directly until now, because naming it too early would have turned it into another performance, another thing to strive for self-consciously, rather than something that simply accrues through honest repetition. You cannot force your way into a new identity by declaring it. You arrive at it the way you arrived at the old one, without ever formally deciding, through thousands of small actions that eventually stopped requiring decisions at all. Look for the evidence in specific moments, rather than abstract feelings, because abstract feelings lie more easily than behavior does. Was there a moment recently where you caught yourself responding to something, the way the newer version of you responds, not because you remembered to, but because it simply happened, faster than deliberation, the way the old pattern used to happen automatically? That's not a coincidence, and it's not luck. That's a pathway that has, through the unglamorous accumulation of 90-second repetitions, become strong enough to fire first, ahead of the pattern that used to have that privilege by default. You may not trust this yet, and that hesitation deserves respect rather than dismissal. Trusting a new identity too early, before it's actually earned its own stability, is its own kind of trap, a premature certainty that collapses the first time real pressure tests it. But there's a difference between healthy caution and reflexive self-doubt, and it's worth learning to tell them apart. Healthy caution says, let's see if this holds under more conditions before I fully believe it. Reflexive self-doubt says, this is probably temporary, and I'll be disappointed if I let myself believe otherwise. And that second voice is not wisdom. It's the old pattern's final, most sophisticated defense, dressed as humility, still trying to protect its old territory by keeping you from fully claiming the new one. Here's something worth sitting with honestly. The people who knew the earlier version of you may still relate to a version that no longer fully exists. Chapter 10 named this dynamic in the context of resistance. But there's a gentler version of it too. Not resistance, just outdated information, held by people who love you and simply haven't updated their internal model yet, because they haven't had the same close, daily access to the accumulation you've been building. This isn't their fault, and it doesn't require confrontation. It just requires patience, the same patience you extended to yourself back in Chapter 7, while the evidence of who you're becoming slowly reaches people who've only had glimpses of it from the outside. There's a question worth asking yourself directly at this stage, one that cuts through abstraction faster than almost anything else in this book. If a stranger watched a full week of your actual behavior, with no access to your internal narration, no knowledge of the story you tell about yourself, what would they conclude you value, based purely on where your attention and effort actually went. That answer, uncomfortable or reassuring as it may be, is closer to the truth of your current identity than anything you could claim about yourself in words. Identity was never primarily a belief. It was always primarily a pattern of action, and you've spent the better part of this book quietly, deliberately, changing the pattern. You don't need to announce this shift to anyone. Announcing it too early tends to invite exactly the kind of external validation seeking that turns genuine change back into performance, the trap named back in Chapter 10. Let the identity keep accumulating in private, the way it's been accumulating this whole time. 90 seconds at a stretch, mostly unnoticed, mostly unwitnessed, and entirely real regardless of who's watching. There's a specific moment worth watching for, one that tends to arrive right after this stage if you catch it in time. The temptation to replace the small, boring fragment with something bigger and more ambitious now that you're feeling stronger. Resist that particular upgrade. The fragment isn't small because you weren't ready for more. It's small because small is what survives indefinitely. And indefinitely, not intensely, is the entire point. Ambition is welcome elsewhere in your life. Here, in this one specific practice, boring and permanent will always outperform impressive and temporary. There's a helpful way to think about this that keeps the maintenance stage from feeling like a punishment. The fragment at this point isn't correcting a flaw anymore. It's more like watering something that's already alive and growing on its own. You don't water a healthy plant because it's dying. You water it because that is simply what keeps a living thing living. And stopping the moment it looks strong is exactly how strong things quietly stop being strong at all. Notice that this evidence never needed an audience to be real. It was never performed for anyone, which is precisely why it holds up under scrutiny. The older, more brittle version of you would never have survived. None of it needed to be loud to be permanent. The person doing this work is not a future version of you, waiting somewhere down the road for enough proof to finally arrive. She's being built right now, today, in the exact moment you're reading this sentence and deciding what to do with the next 90 seconds in front of you. There was never going to be a single day marked transformation complete. There was only ever this one wave at a time, reshaping a coastline too slowly to notice, until the day you finally look back and can't quite locate the person who started this book. Chapter 14. One System, Not 14 Ideas. You've been handed a lot of pieces across these chapters, and pieces, held separately, can start to feel like homework instead of a way of living. This chapter exists to put them back together, not as a summary, but as a single working system you could actually run for the rest of your life without needing to reread anything. Here's the whole architecture, stripped down to what actually matters. Everything starts with attention, the resource you spend every second whether you notice it or not. Wherever attention repeats, a pathway strengthens, automatically, indifferent to whether the thought is true, responsive only to frequency. That's the entire mechanism underneath every result in your life right now. The relationship, the number in the account, the way you talk to yourself in an empty room. Not mystical, mechanical. For most of your life, that mechanism ran without your permission, built by a much younger version of you doing the only intelligent thing available given the evidence in front of her, and then left uncontested for decades because nothing in the system prompts a review of conclusions once they're formed. You didn't fail to notice this because you were careless. You didn't notice because functional denial did exactly what it's designed to do, kept the file closed until you had enough capacity to survive opening it. Opening it wasn't the end of the work. It was the beginning, because insight alone never dismantled a pathway this well built. What actually moved the needle was smaller and far less dramatic than insight. One deliberately chosen thought, held for 90 seconds, at the same hour every day, small enough to survive contact with a bad mood, boring enough to survive its own eventual success, attached to a cue already automatic in your day, so it didn't depend on remembering or feeling motivated. That fragment met resistance almost immediately. And the resistance wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of contest. The old pathway noticing competition for the first time in years, and defending itself the only way it knows how. Through sudden reasonableness, through comparison, through wisdom that only ever seems to arrive exactly when things start changing. You learn to recognize its shape instead of arguing with it. And you kept going anyway, especially on the days it would have been easiest to stop. Because those days were never the exception. They were where the real work happened. You learned that a lapse and a collapse are different events. That skipping one day was never the danger, only the decision, made in the emotional aftermath, to stop showing up entirely. You learned that other people carry pathways too, that their discomfort with your growth is real without being your responsibility to manage, and that some relationships only worked because you were smaller, a fact that hurts to see clearly and is worth seeing clearly anyway. You traced the pattern back to its root, not to find someone to blame, but to understand that it was never irrational, that it made complete sense given who built it and what she was protecting, and that understanding this doesn't excuse what happened. It simply frees you from carrying a decades-old conclusion as though it were still current information. And somewhere in the accumulation of all of this, something shifted that no single day could take credit for. The fragment stopped being something you performed and became something closer to what you simply are. Not because you declared it, because you repeated it, past the point of urgency, past the point of needing anyone to witness it, until a new coastline had quietly replaced the old one. Here's the part worth holding on to longer than any individual chapter. This system doesn't have a finish line, and that isn't bad news. A finish line would mean the practice eventually becomes unnecessary, and nothing in this book has ever claimed that. What it claims instead is that the 90 seconds gets easier to sustain, not because the mechanism changes, but because you finally understand it well enough to work with it instead of against it, the way a sailor doesn't stop needing wind once she learns to read it. She simply stops fighting it. You will, at some point, encounter a new pattern this system hasn't addressed yet, a different debt accumulating quietly in a different room of your life. When that happens, you won't need a new book. You'll recognize the shape immediately, because you've already learned to see it. The flinch away from a truth, the case being quietly built to defend an old identity, the small fragment that could start pulling a new pathway into competition with an old one. The system was never really about the specific pattern named in these chapters. It was about learning to see the mechanism itself, clearly enough that it stops needing to hide in order to keep running. That's the actual inheritance of this work, larger than any single fixed habit or healed relationship. You are no longer someone who lives entirely at the mercy of thoughts that arrived before you had any say in choosing them. You are someone who knows now, in your body as much as your mind, that attention is a decision, that repetition is a kind of authorship, and that the coastline in front of you, however it looks right now, is still being shaped, wave by wave, by exactly the same hands that are holding this sentence. There's one more piece worth holding on to, because it's the part that keeps a system like this from ever curdling into another form of self-improvement pressure. None of this was ever about becoming a flawless version of yourself who never lapses, never doubts, never wakes up on a hard morning wanting to skip the 90 seconds. That person doesn't exist, and was never the goal. The goal was always smaller and more durable than perfection. Someone who knows the mechanism well enough to return to it, again and again, for the rest of a life that will keep handing out hard mornings regardless of how much progress came before them. Returning, not perfecting, is the actual skill this entire book has been quietly building in you, one repetition at a time. This is why the 14th chapter of any real transformation rarely feels dramatic from the inside. It feels closer to housekeeping, the quiet maintenance of something already built, which is exactly what it's supposed to feel like by now. Consolidation was never going to announce itself with fireworks. It shows up instead as a kind of quiet you haven't felt in years. The specific quiet of a system finally running the way it was always meant to, without needing your constant supervision to keep doing so. You built that quiet the same way you built everything else in this book, one small, unglamorous repetition at a time, and it will keep holding for exactly as long as you keep feeding it. One more chapter remains, and it isn't asking you to learn anything new. It's asking you to finally close the loop this book opened in its very first minute, the one you've been carrying, half-answered, since before you knew any of this had a name. Chapter 15. The Room You Build Next. Go back to the beginning of this book. The message you read 4 times, the coffee going cold, the thumb hovering over a screen holding a sentence you already knew by heart. You've carried a question since that first page, half-formed unanswered on purpose because it wasn't ready to be answered yet. It's ready now. Here is what that opening scene actually was. Not a moment of bad luck. Not something that happened to you. It was the final visible frame of a room you had been building for a long time, one unnoticed thought at a time, long before the message ever arrived. The silence you didn't fill. The truth you filed away instead of facing. The old pathway running its familiar route while you called it just how things are. Every one of those small, forgettable moments was a board nailed into place. And by the time the message came, the room was already finished. The message didn't build it. The message only turned the lights on. This is the sentence this entire book has been walking you toward, and it will land differently now than it would have on page 1. You did not lose what you're grieving. You constructed with total sincerity and zero conscious intention the exact conditions under which losing it became the only available outcome. That is not a life sentence handed down against you. It's the most liberating fact in this entire book, because anything built by repeated, unexamined attention can be unbuilt the same way, one repeated, examined thought at a time. You have already proven that to yourself over the last 14 chapters. You are not being asked to believe it. You're being asked to recognize what you've already done. Now the second thread, the one planted in the 4th paragraph you read before any of this had a name. The question was never what you do with your time. It was what you do with what remains of you after the time runs out. You didn't understand that sentence then. You weren't supposed to. It needed the entire distance of this book to make sense. And here is what it actually means. Time was never the scarce resource in your life. Attention was. You can spend an identical hour scrolling through a replayed argument, or spend that same hour laying one more board across the gap Chapter 7 described, and the clock registers no difference between them. Only the coastline does. What remains of you at the end of any given day isn't measured in hours logged. It's measured in which pathway got fed, and which one got starved of the fuel it needed to keep running. This is why the fragment was never really about 90 seconds. 90 seconds was simply the smallest unit small enough for you to actually believe in, back before you'd built any evidence that belief was warranted. What it was actually training, the entire time, was your relationship to the only resource that was ever truly yours to spend, where your attention goes moment to moment, on purpose instead of by default. You are going to build another room after this one. That's not a warning, it's simply what minds do, what yours has always done, what every mind does for as long as it's alive and paying attention to anything at all. The difference now is that you know the mechanism by name. You know what a pathway feels like while it's forming, not just after it's calcified into something you mistake for fact. You know the shape resistance takes when it shows up wearing wisdom's clothes. You know a lapse from a collapse, and you know which one actually costs you something. Nobody handed you any of this at the start. You built it, the same way you build everything, through repetition, patient enough to survive its own good days and its own terrible ones. Here's the last distinction this book has to offer, and it matters more than every one that came before it. There's a difference between a person who has fixed something and a person who has learned to see. Fixing implies an ending, a problem solved and shelved. Seeing doesn't end. It's a way of moving through every room you'll ever walk into for the rest of your life. Watching the boards go up in real time instead of finding out, years later, that a wall was finished without your permission. You are not leaving this book fixed. You are leaving it able to see, which is worth considerably more, because seeing travels with you into rooms this book never anticipated. Think one more time about the version of you standing in that kitchen at the very beginning, staring at a message she'd already read 4 times. She wasn't weak. She wasn't broken. She was simply looking at the finished shape of a room she'd built without knowing she was building it, thought by thought, avoidance by avoidance, across months she couldn't have named at the time. You are not required to feel sorry for her. You're required to recognize her, because she's the reason you picked this book up in the first place. And everything since that first page has been the process of teaching her what nobody taught either of you before now. She is not gone. She's underneath everything you've built across these 15 chapters, the same way she was always underneath the furniture Chapter 1 described, patient, unbothered by time, and finally, for the first time in longer than you can measure, being listened to instead of managed. You know how this works now. Attention repeated becomes a pathway. A pathway repeated becomes a room. A room lived in long enough becomes a life you didn't consciously choose and can't quite remember building. That was always true, running in the background of every day you've ever lived, whether or not you had the language for it. The only thing that changed across these 15 chapters is that you finally do. There's a final practical truth worth carrying out of this book and into whatever room comes next. The mechanism doesn't announce which pathway is currently active. It simply runs the one that's strongest, silently, without asking permission, the same way it always has. This means vigilance isn't a phase you graduate out of. It's closer to a permanent, quiet practice. The same 90 seconds, the same attention, applied for as long as you're someone capable of thought at all. That's not a burden. It's closer to breathing. Something you do without resentment because you understand finally that it's simply what keeps a life pointed in the direction you actually chose instead of the direction old furniture happened to face. None of this ever needed drama to be real. The quietest chapters in this book were, in a very real sense, the most important ones, because quiet is what change actually sounds like once it stops requiring your constant supervision to keep running. The room you build next is already under construction. It started the moment you picked this book up, continued through every 90 seconds you gave it, and it does not end on this page. It ends nowhere because it was never meant to. It simply continues the way a coastline continues, wave after wave, in whatever direction your attention decides, starting now, to go. The Room You Build, a Narrative Based on the Master Key System, by Charles F. Haanel.